Is there going to be a third temple built in Jerusalem? And if so, how and when is it rebuilt? Does Elijah the prophet have anything to do with it? This is a very controversial topic in prophetic circles. There are a lot of people not expecting Elijah to return, thinking he already has returned in the person of John the Baptist. And there are a lot of people thinking the third temple won't be rebuilt either. But here we are today talking about both subjects. So let's dive in. First, why would we think that Elijah is coming back or has come back? In the final book of the Old Testament, Malachi, and in its final verses we read, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." Malachi 4:5. That's pretty clear that Elijah is returning or has returned. If you remember the story of Elijah, he spiritually overcame the 400 prophets of Baal who worked for Queen Jezebel of Israel, and he beat them on Mount Carmel. Elijah called down fire from heaven on his offering while the Baal prophets couldn't. Later, after his prophetic career was over, he ascended into heaven on a fiery chariot in a foreshadow of the rapture. He was one of only 2 people who ascended into heaven without dying. It's that Elijah. And Malachi tells us he will return or has returned to the earth. Or could it be both? Let's investigate. When John the Baptist was born, his father Zechariah prophesied that John would minister in the spirit of Elijah. Jesus would tell his disciples later that Elijah had already come in the person of John the Baptist. Well, that's pretty convincing, isn't it? You can see why many would think that Elijah had already come and there was no need for him to come again. But this thinking misses several important points. First, that Elijah would come possibly 3 times, not just 2, and that there's nothing saying that this isn't possible. Second, look what John the Baptist himself had to say to the Jewish leaders. Now, this is the testimony of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" and confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" And he said, "I am not." John 1:19 through 21. Did you catch that? John clearly said he was not John the Baptist. Anyone thinking he was needs to study that verse. He came in Elijah's spirit, but he wasn't Elijah himself. Malachi says Elijah himself is coming. Second, look carefully at what Jesus says about John. And his disciples asked him, saying, "Why then did the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you, Elijah has already come, and they did not know him." Matthew 17:10 through 12. So Jesus is clear that Elijah is coming in the future, and that at that time he will restore all things, future tense. Plus, this is something John never did. He didn't restore all things. However, John did come in the spirit of Elijah as well. In other words, Elijah was coming 3 times, not just 2. So those who say that John was Elijah are partially right, and those who say he is coming in the last days are correct as well. It's both, not either or. Now, is that confusing? You bet it is. That is why there's so many arguments about Elijah. However, the bottom line is that this analysis shows that Elijah is returning. He will be one of the 2 witnesses from Revelation 11. And if you are aware, those who practice Judaism know he's coming also. Each Passover, they set a place for Elijah at their Seder meal and an extra cup of wine on the dinner table. They also have a child open the door for the prophet, hoping that he'll come into their home. To the Jews, Elijah's return is said to mark the Messiah's earthly arrival. The fact that the Jews are waiting for Elijah is really a key end-time fact that will influence what happens from there on in regard to the third temple. So let's keep that in mind as we keep working through this video today. Now, we looked at Malachi 4 just a moment ago, but in Malachi 3, Elijah is linked to both the Messiah and the temple. Let's look at it. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord, who you seek, will suddenly come to his temple. Malachi 3:1. Those practicing Judaism who know this verse link Elijah with the future temple in Jerusalem. The New Testament does as well. In Revelation chapter 11, there's a verse that asks the Apostle John to measure the temple of God and they who worship therein, but to leave out the court that is without, because it's given to the Gentiles. Revelation 11, 1 through 2. This passage immediately precedes the passages about the two witnesses, one of whom we now know is Elijah. So there is a link. And that link is what we're exploring today, how Elijah and the other witness related to the temple. Now, we know this is not the original temple that the Romans destroyed in 70 AD because John wrote Revelation about 95 AD. So the temple had already been gone for 25 years. This is definitely a future temple John was measuring. If you had been living back in the time when the book of Revelation was written, the Temple Mount would have been in ruins. No stone would have been left upon another, according to Jesus' prophecy in Matthew 24. So this means it is highly likely that a new temple will be built, or at least a tent will be set up. Something will be there. Now, just like Elijah, there is controversy about the temple. A large number of Christians believe a third temple won't be built. Let's look at that for a second before we start to discuss Elijah's role with the temple further, because we have to know something is coming. The reason these well-meaning Christians feel this way about a future temple is the same as with the return of Elijah. It's an either-or thinking, an exclusivity in their thinking. You see, in multiple places in Scripture, Paul informs us that the hearts of believers have become the dwelling place of God, or, in other words, the temple of God, that God will no longer dwell in a temple made by hands. And this is completely correct. God does dwell in the hearts of believers. We are his temple now, so to speak. However, this doesn't preclude a physical temple of some sort being built, one where blasphemous sacrifices are made, one where Jesus is not worshipped. Obviously, such a temple would be like any other type of pagan edifice, many of which exist all over the world. Believers being the dwelling place of God doesn't preclude a third temple. It isn't going to be the dwelling place of God. It will be a blasphemous place where eventually the Antichrist will dwell. And in Matthew 24, 15 through 16, the abomination stands in the holy place. In 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 4, the man of sin sits in the dwelling place of God. And as we just saw in Revelation 11, 1 through 2, John measures a future temple with an altar and outer courts. None of these things can be the human heart. We can't stand in a human heart. We can't sit in it, nor does it have an altar or outer courts. These things all refer to a physical temple in Jerusalem, or at least some sort of structure. Now, what shape will this temple take? Well, as we said, it could be a tent, similar to the tabernacle in the wilderness where Moses and Aaron worshipped. That could be set up in a matter of hours. It could be a temple of stone, similar to the one that used to stand on the Temple Mount, or, and possibly likely, it could be the Dome of the Rock itself that currently stands on the mount. Yes, surprisingly, the dome might have shared use in the future, shared use that is negotiated. You know, Muslims on Friday, Jews on Sabbath, and maybe even Christians on Sunday. I could potentially see that happening. Jews believe the Dome of the Rock is in the exact correct spot that the ancient temples of Solomon and Zerubbabel stood, and that the foundation stone under the dome is the spot where the Ark of the Covenant was. Is it possible that Muslims will negotiate away use of the dome on Shabbat for land or other considerations? It's more than possible, especially if a religious false Muslim Messiah tells them to do it. Think about that. Imagine if a Mahdi or 12th Imam arises and instructs his followers to allow the dome to be used by the Jews for 1 day a week. They view this Mahdi as their Messiah. They'd listen to anything he says. So don't discount this idea. The third temple could already be in place in the building of the Dome of the Rock. And although the building is sacrilegious, the ground it's built on is holy. It is the holy place chosen by God. So, if it is used in this way, maybe it fulfills prophecy. Or as we said, maybe a tent or a new building is constructed. All three ideas are possible. And here is another idea that perhaps you haven't considered about the last days. Look at what Jesus said in Matthew 24 as one of the major signs that the end was upon us. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a witness to all the nations, or ethnos in the Greek, and then the end will come. Matthew 24:14. So Jesus said, the gospel will be preached, and that is the sign of the end. Prior to this, in Matthew 24, Jesus said a couple of times that the end was not yet. But it isn't until the gospel is preached to all the ethnos or people groups on earth that the end finally comes. Jesus said it will be a witness to the nations. Notice that. But who does this? A number of Christian denominations believe it is the church who preaches it. The Joshua Project measures how many unsaved people groups there are on earth to see how close the church is to completing this assignment. By the way, they estimate there are still approximately 7,500 people groups who haven't heard the gospel. That's a pretty big number, and it's not shrinking as fast as it was just a couple years ago. Now, others think it is the angel who preaches the gospel in Revelation 14 upon the return of Jesus. But another idea I have that I've never heard anyone else talk about is that this preaching might be the preaching of the two witnesses that accomplishes this fact. They are witnesses, after all, and witnesses witness. And Jesus said this preaching would be a witness. So does Matthew 24 actually contain this verse as an offhand reference to the work of the two witnesses sharing the gospel and it being broadcast to the whole world? Well, maybe so. Remember, the coming of Elijah is given to us in Malachi 4:5 as a sign before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, before the end. This idea really fits perfectly. I think this might be the most likely thing that Jesus was communicating with this sign, but only time will tell. But when does the temple get built? The tent gets set up, or the Dome of the Rock gets shared use? Well, we know with certainty that it occurs prior to the midpoint of the 70th week of Daniel, because at that point, the man of sin sits in the temple and declares himself God. So it has to be in place at that point. We also know from Revelation 11:1-2 that John measures the temple, and only then is the holy city trampled by the Gentiles for 42 months, which we know as the last half of the 70th week of Daniel. So it is absolutely necessary that something be in place prior to that time. Will Elijah and the other witness encourage the building of the temple? That's a big question. Jews think he will. But you think about it. They will oppose the use of the temple because it and the sacrifices are blasphemous. The hearts of believers are the dwelling place of God now, not a temple. And Jesus is our once and for all sacrifice for sin. There is no need for these animal sacrifices. But we know that the sacrifices will occur. So it is almost a certainty in my mind that Elijah will oppose them. The Orthodox Jews will be celebrating what they consider their greatest success in 2,000 years in getting a temple and sacrifices started again, when along comes these two guys in sackcloth and ashes saying Jesus is the Messiah. They've been wrong about that, and that the sacrifices they're doing are blasphemous. Do you think there will be opposition to them? You know it. You know there will be opposition, great opposition. That is why the Bible says if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and consumes their enemies. That if anyone wants to harm them, they must be killed in this manner. Revelation 11:5. It says this because a lot of people are going to want to harm these witnesses during the 1260 days of their ministry. Yet God gives them the power during this time. They have power to do this and to bring plagues on the earth, to cause a 3.5-year drought, to turn water into blood, and to bring any manner of plague on the earth, kind of like Moses and Pharaoh. They will be hated by the non-believers, to say the least. But they are invincible for the 3.5 years of their ministry. However, when they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. Revelation 11:7. So when they accomplish their witness, when they preach the gospel to all the ethnos on earth, then the end will come. We know the beast likely possesses the man who will become the Antichrist at the midpoint of the 70th week. Is it at that moment that the two witnesses are killed right before he sits in the temple of God? Do they minister during the first half of the 70th week of Daniel? It's really hard to say, but it seems the most likely possibility. And is it the killing of the witnesses that propels the Antichrist to sit in the temple and proclaim himself as God? His ability to kill those two that seemed invincible, that were able to do all these miraculous things, the world would say, wow, this guy is even greater than those who we could not touch. Those who criticize the temple, the Antichrist will say. So after he has victory over them, that is the moment we believe he uses to take complete control and worship from the world and sit in that temple. It's almost a symbol. He's sort of saying, the witnesses were wrong about the temple, so that's where I'm going. I'm going to sit there. And it is the beast that rises from the abyss that eventually empowers this person, who once was just a human, to be able to accomplish this. Dr. Doug Hamp, a friend of mine, suggests this empowerment happens with a genetic upgrade. If that's so, and if the Antichrist then begins to offer a similar upgrade to others, you can imagine how popular that upgrade would be. Imagine you can have the same upgrade I had that allowed me to defeat the two witnesses. The witnesses lay in the streets then for 3.5 days while the unredeemed celebrate. And then the witnesses are raised to life and called up into heaven. We read that at that very hour, a great earthquake knocked down 1/10 of the city and killed 7,000 men. Now, 7,000 is a very interesting number, a number related to Elijah in the Old Testament. It says that in the time of Elijah, 7,000 had not bowed their knee to Baal. In the end times, we see 7,000 dying in the earthquake. It's another parallel to Elijah. But who is the other witness? One is Elijah, but who is the other? Click right here to keep watching. Some say Moses, some say Enoch, some say the Apostle John, and some have other ideas. We'll let you know ours in the next video. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.